Okay, thank you, Sue, and Susan, the other principals of the UNIKE project, and Chris for inviting me to give this talk. 3 years ago, members of this audience debated the death of the public university. We took positions from the university in ruins to the university at various points on different trajectories to ruins. The university is zombie. The university is hollowed out of its progressive and emancipatory potential, if not its will and capacity to critique. And the university as still vital platform for critical scholarship and various projects of positive social change. Much of the discussion centred on the category of the university. Last October, in a public lecture here on campus, Stefan Collini gave a defence of the university by forensically deconstructing rankings and their work. While referring to different universities and basing much of his argument on the inbuilt and self-reinforcing biases towards elite universities in the way that rankings are constructed, interpreted, and used, the university to be protected seemed very much like Oxbridge, and the contextualising debates seemed very British. Despite these various distancings, I enjoyed the crisp intellectualism of the talk. However, one listening graduate student reflected afterwards that she was over the category of the university. I took this to be an expression of both frustration and fatigue from a student who had previously been a passionate advocate. Frustration at distanced and highbrow defences of an institution that affords great privilege to a few, and a deep fatigue from waging unwinnable contests against student fee increases and commercialising logics, as well as from deconstructive critique as a mode of being as much as a mode of doing. The comment ought to be seen less as a throwaway, I think, and more as a deep challenge to the delegates at this conference to grapple with contradictions, unpack arguments, and perhaps shift to a more variegated understanding of the university. The images of my own university are more variegated and hopeful than the ivory tower and the insipid brand, which you can see. Must we, as Inglis does in his favourable review of Collini's book, mobilise the figure of the dinner ladies? And must we conclude that all we can do is warn? That's the challenge I wish to unpack a little today, without appearing as a dreadful quisling. Delegates at this conference need no reminding of the changes that are gripping our universities and what's at stake. Abstracted from the abstracts of this week's conference, the list is very long. It runs from funding priorities to commercialisation, bibliometrics, branding, MOOCs, internal cost accounting, new governance arrangements, the collapse of collegial governance, and much else besides. We are experiencing an avalanche of change, to borrow a metaphor from Michael Barber, to whom I will return shortly. These changes are, of course, linked upwards to and constitutive of the great neoliberalising and globalising processes and geopolitical shifts of the late 20th century, to new public managerial concentration of the exercise of state powers, and to crises of accumulation and over-accumulation, as well as to fine-grained technologies of control that entrepreneurialise and responsibilise academics. They are, by and large, regressive and regrettable, and most in this audience have railed against them. Geographer Nigel Thrift, prominent blogger on the future of higher education, recently knighted Vice-Chancellor of Warwick University and possibly the target of Inglis's quisling quip, has summed up the challenges facing the university as a government unwillingness to fund university education, growing problems of social exclusion, growing inequalities between universities, constricted possibilities for research careers, the rise of the third sector, impact assessment, and the diminishing capacity of universities to address world problems. For academics and students living through them, these pressures and changes have gripped at the level of the body and subjectivity as well as practice. Academics face increasing pressures on time and resources that threaten to deflect attention from teaching, public good research and public engagement. They resent the way these changes have driven a particular form of heightened competitiveness so deeply and probably unnecessarily into our knowledge production practices and daily routines. That they have changed what we do and what we are, undermined our potential, and made us, wittingly or otherwise, the agents of the changes themselves. Our students protest annually against the increasing fees that they must pay and the loans that they must take out. Further afield, debates about student fees and rising debt levels rage on in the UK, Europe and the United States, along with concerns about social inequities of access and debt and the rise of multi-tier university hierarchies. As US student debt passes $1 trillion, these concerns, along with a broader analysis of the demise of US higher education, thanks Fazil for the 5-word synopsis, have been picked up in the 2014 film Ivory Tower, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and is in mainstream distribution. You can watch it on your Air New Zealand flight home. For New Zealand delegates, these challenges are posed in a landscape short on alternative policy imagination. In the months following Collini's talk, the Vice-Chancellors of our 2 largest universities have defended the universities in the dialogues pages of the New Zealand Herald, defending them by advocating a market-led drive for excellence, targeted at global measures of quality and underpinned by either higher student fees or a reduction in the number of institutions. The vision rests on mobile and rational students and academics clearing a quality market. Ironically, perhaps, the most interesting recent post-Collini commentary was carried in the notoriously neoliberal business weekly, the National Business Review. Professor Paul Moen, a food scientist, director of the Redet Institute Centre of Research Excellence, and winner of the 2012 Prime Minister's Science Prize for contributions to exporting food, suggests that along with the predictable establishing closer connections with business, universities must attend to broad-based educational experiences, really understanding what is meant by the research-teaching nexus and focus on the broader total educational experience, and strategically knowing what they stand for. While academics again must do the imagining of what this means in practice, my first substantive point is that this kind of prescription creates some room in which to vitalise the university. But before getting too far ahead of myself, my aim today is to seek relief from this fug by reflecting on how we might continue to practice critical scholarship, both within the university and from the university, and how we might find ways to do university differently as a platform for critical research, all the while still rallying against disabling change, being attentive to and critical of its rationalities, and acting to oppose further erosions of institutional autonomy and academic freedom. This is what I mean by making a call for a more than oppositional critical politics. If there is a short answer to these questions, it is, I think, that we are already doing this, but rarely think or talk about what it is that we're doing. I begin by suggesting 2 necessary intellectual moves. First, rethinking critical practice, and then thinking beneath the category of the university. It's not now enough, if it ever has been, to reveal, deconstruct and critique without responsibility. That is, to indulge, as Boland suggests, in a discourse which transforms and unmasks other truth claims and replaces them with what he says is a starker vision of reality. This is a form of critique, he suggests, that is promiscuously, and these are his words, connected with cynicism, and risks becoming a sort of permanent and variegated opposition to different forms of constraint. It risks taking for granted the critic and conscience clause enshrined in New Zealand's Education Act as defence of academic freedom, or treating it as a right to practice only a passively disengaged and deconstructive critique. it might be more interesting to ask what kind of critical practice is now possible or meaningful. Matheson Russell yesterday suggested that the clause of critic and conscience authorises universities and its academics to be active political participants and gives them the freedom to question and test received wisdom, advance different ideas, criticise public powers, and to hold them to account. These are his words from a publication. We might go further to suggest that the clause imposes an individual and collective responsibility to do this. At a time when the state no longer sits so obviously as the actor that might respond to criticism and make material any alternative thinking, with or without explicitly articulated recommendations from researchers, for example. And public choice theory presents alternative thinking as narrowly self-interested. But recommendation to policy is no longer the simple option here. As a geographer in a science faculty, I occasionally have this conversation with ecologists and other environmental scientists who cannot understand often why the government does not act on their science. Arguably, as social scientists, we should know better. The state does not make policy and command resources and investment decisions as it once did. While in the new state we are researchers, deliverers of evidence by instrumental means, not keepers of a deeper knowledge. We are the sector, often lumped together with Crown Research Institutes in the New Zealand context. We are a group with definable, common, consistent and rationally articulated stakes. We are to be consulted rather than to be trusted with the capacity or moral authority to define alternative national or community goods, or to argue from anything other than from sectarian positions. This suggests, I suspect, that we need to find new actors with whom to engage and new ways of engaging with the state, while still building concepts and still critiquing at a distance. Thinking deeper within the university. In much of my own scholarship, I use the work of Timothy Mitchell, Michel Callon, and even Nigel Thrift to deconstruct the category of the economy. Economies are messy, and I have begun to use metaphors such as that of assemblage to draw attention to their partiality and temporariness, as well as to the active assembling of actors, objects, relations, practices, regulation, investment trajectories, objects, and so on, that constitute them. Through such a lens, a university might be seen as less the fully autonomous, singular, preordained and somewhat paradoxical configuration of disciplines and unconstrained academics and students who are safely located away on the hill above the town and above the state often. In practice, they are looser and more multiverse assemblages of different types of students and academics, knowledge production traditions, political projects of the Enlightenment, disciplinary configurations, and so on. Even before we throw in the student loans, research institutes, interdisciplinary networks, research offices, commercialising units, and HR, PR, and staff service centres of today's universities, along with its performative and calculative objects, EFTs, FTEs, KPIs, rankings, H indices, rates of return, and so on. And of course, universities are located in different places with different histories, statuses, and student catchments, and with different funding and regulatory regimes. Any university is a complex and variegated institution, and all actualised universities are different assemblages of often different elements. The roar of the avalanche of change contains discordant and or context-specific notes arising from different actualised neoliberalisms, differences in the way that the pressures play out among and within different universities. The equity gains from mass education, new targeted equity programs, and the enduring absences, silences, and class, gendered, and other privileges of the academy, along with various romanticisations that swirl around. Those in the arts and humanities need to be wary of seeing universities only from where they inhabit them, and from the type of university that they inhabit. without actively researching what goes on in medical schools, science labs, law libraries, ICT suites, and so on, and engaging with the different projects of social good that are often launched and developed in those spaces, we risk privileging the role of the university as critique of power in domains of economy and social politics only. In my part of the university, I see laboratories, modelling programs, field machines, and the budgets that my students fund to sustain them. I also encounter some of the many projects of the Enlightenment still at work in different parts of the university. Despite the assault on institutional autonomy and researcher-initiated research that threaten the capacity to exercise academic freedom by identifying the questions worth asking for academics. In the 2013 document An Avalanche is Coming, a joint publication by Higher Education Corporation Pearson, the Institute for Public Policy Research, and Universities UK, Michael Barber put the question of unbundling of university practices firmly in the middle of the avalanche. Although clearly designed as an intervention to bring into being that of which it speaks, and to act as advertorial for the privatisation of universities, the document points to the breaking up, contracting out, privatisation and globalisation of research, teaching, curriculum, funding, conferring degrees, all of those dimensions that constitute the university. Unbundling is the language of the asset strippers of the 1980s, who sought to create money, profits, from socially created rents and release values for commercial realisation. Unbundling will intensify many of the pressures on the university. However, in his conclusion to the foreword, Lawrence Summers observed that the future of the university belongs to those who rebundle creatively, for they will find that they have reinvented higher education for the 21st century. Very biblical kind of language. Rebundling, then, is a curiously derived, hopeful metaphor, at least in my take on this, for the university, and leads me to ask whether it is possible to find and learn from examples of creative rebundling or alternative ways of performing critique or simply living with these changes on at least partially different terms. The third mission is a term used in EU policy to refer to a broadly interpreted raft of university engagements with various publics. In research on its rise in New Zealand, about which you will hear more later today, Chris Shaw, Nigel Howarth, John Morgan and myself, we've encountered a dominant variant of the third mission. Although unnamed as such, it reduces towards the pursuit of external revenue through commercialising and marketising relations. This mission resides in a new language for knowing and performing the university: commercialisation units and research institutes, new research office practices and expertise and their proliferation, and a host of new subjectivities. We hypothesise that it may be supplanting more or less subtly the first and second missions of the university, teaching and public good research. However, we also encountered diversity in the way it is articulated with the other two missions across the universities of New Zealand, and some interesting deployments of it. These included commitments to more engaged and dialogical pedagogy in science education and business schools, associated with the Centres of Research Excellence and new programs of science enterprise, respectively. Whilst lacking critical reflexivity and demanding the sort of critique levelled yesterday by Karina Baliban at the performative figure of the knowledge worker in this teaching, these programs take seriously both preparing their students for an altered world and experimenting with learning. We also encountered multiple cross-faculty and cross-institutional initiatives among scientists deeply committed to identifying opportunities to do fundamental science, as well as a determination to engage publicly albeit in a communication sort of way. We encountered CSAFE, the Centre for Sustainable Agriculture, Food, Energy and Environment, where I spent a day 3 weeks ago as a casual visitor. Press-ganged into being quizmaster in the compulsory, collectively completed daily morning tea quiz from the Otago Daily Times that they all sit to do on a daily basis. I witnessed the welcome to the group of a new Fulbright MA scholar, one of 3 currently working at the centre, where there are also currently 14 PhD students and 4 postdocs, all working on questions of socio-environmental politics. In the words of its founder, Hugh Campbell, it was launched informally in 2001 on a conjunction of possibilities to pursue politically motivated research on things green and things social. He notes that there was complex institutional stuff going on, and with the research group in the media, they formed a virtual centre. He adds that if we hadn't been quite so successful, we would have got into trouble, as this was not approved. Formalised in 2006, CSAFE has dedicated itself to a particular socio-environmental and food politics, and to engaging that politics with economic actors in agri-food, whilst building a genuine global leadership in rural sociology and agri-food studies. At the core of its approach has been a community ethic, commitments to students, and a realpolitik of engaging critically and creatively with economic and policy actors, and New Zealand's cloying economic nationalism as foundation, as foundation, I think, to building intellectual foundations for supporting rural communities. So the politics is directed to that. The quiz and a regular column in the newspaper, along with alumni networks that its student focus have created, are, as Hugh suggests, pivotal to the centre's success. In interview, he directed our attention to the value of these alumni networks in generating new contracts to keep the centre running. So there is a game being played here by an entrepreneurial academic, but a game played connected to a particular politics. It has not always been easy to survive the pressures of competitive soft funding. For CSAFE and half a dozen other similar centres across New Zealand's universities, it is not easy to have staff on short-term contracts. Every leader of one of these centres to whom I've talked has spoken of being awake in the early hours of the morning, worrying about their staff and whether they will have jobs. It's not easy then to have staff on short-term contracts, to negotiate complex arrangements with departments over FTs and FTEs. These centres are always skillfully and cleverly crafted into the established structure of the university. And to be continually writing funding bids. And all the while under increasing pressures from universities to get contracts, and squeezed by new managerial technologies and the encroachment of various forms of what might be called exhortation expertise. Go and get us new contracts and we will show you how, and we will tie your hands and we will possibly tell you which contracts to bid for. Ngāpai o Te Maramatanga, the Centre of Research Excellence to which Tracy McIntosh introduced us yesterday, is another example of a political project of knowledge production thriving in and across universities. It has initiated, funded and stewarded a range of critical scholarship, research and community engagement, and built a very different form of third mission in practice, and a very different ethos of critical practice. It has found transformative ways to tick the boxes and to speak the language of new public management when required. While its capability to do all this is born of a complex politics and related resources that are New Zealand specific, it demonstrates that academic freedom and critical engagement can be exercised differently. In my own work, I've been encouraged by Law and Urry and Gibson Graham to practice a more muted politics. In my case, it's more muted, of potentiality, by engaging with others to know otherwise. Together with my research collaborators, we've sought to build what we're calling inactive research. One of the features of this work is to run workshops and Chatham House engagements with different policy, community and economic actors, not to lecture or to question them, but to discuss questions in our terms rather than those of stakeholder consultation or dissemination, to discuss our concepts. These terms, our terms, are experimentation, non-sectarianism, and engagement, and a willingness to engage with unfamiliar ideas and unfamiliar others, often under Chatham House rules. Our project is pointedly political, to learn, influence, and co-produce knowledge, and to foster collectivity and collective institutions. That is, to make a relevance for our critical work and create conceptual collective goods to which we can commit. We developed this approach from work on the Building Research Capability in the Social Sciences Initiative, generously funded more than 10 years ago now to build networks across disciplines, institutions and generations at the national level, to foster new research agendas and to enhance an institutional profile for social science. A combination of accident and creative leadership resulted in a trajectory for this initiative in which it took its own direction, guided by those committed enough to engage. Those involved over-delivered on deliverables and reporting requirements and used the freedom that created to focus attention on encouraging and supporting specific national networks of scholars. Māori researchers, early career researchers, Pasifika researchers, New Settler researchers and graduate students. It spawned a later initiative, ESOC-SCI, that has in turn given birth to a set of about 20 active and thematic research networks that assemble researchers from across the country and across the disciplines for regular cyber meetings and occasional conferences. No longer funded, these networks are generally led by early to mid-career researchers and are beginning to pay dividends in the form of journal special issues and new research agendas. They also involve academics in conversations with ministry officials, activists and independent community and NGO researchers. A steering committee maintains the website and continues to engage with government ministries on issues of research funding and social science capability, as well as particular questions. We are here today as a result of 2 successive EU-funded multinational research projects that have examined the future of universities. URGE and UNIKE. Both have involved significant forms of funding and have been made possible by the mobilisation of heavy CVs of prominent critical scholars, careful analysis and strategic creative interpretation of the EU's Europe-making aims and new managerial language, and skillful grants personship. URGE was co-funded by MORST, our Ministry of Research, Science and Technology in its old name, under its Science Exchange Programme, and our new Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment has supported this conference. I'm not sure that critical theorising of the knowledge economy and industry training in universities were ever part of the funders' visions, but the projects have over-delivered on their promises to engage with the economic actors involved, to produce research and to present opportunities for PhD students. These projects are not narrowly subversive or some sneaky sleight of hand. Rather, careful attention to the details of the contract and over-delivering have facilitated further critical knowledge production, as well as an engagement via critical ideas with economic policy within and beyond the universities. The Global Higher Ed weblog, edited by Chris Olds and Susan Robertson, was established in 2007. It claims to receive approximately 10 to 14,000 visits a month from people associated with consulting firms, credit rating agencies, these are its words, foundations and funding councils, higher education associations, the media, ministries, and associated development agencies, multilateral agencies, and universities, including students, administrators, and faculty. And these from all around the world. The blog carries entries from many of these sources and has defined a research field and a space for engagement founded on critical thinking. It has paved the way for Chris and Susan to access figures, rooms, and presentation platforms to which critical academics are rarely ever given access. In their latest engagement, the launch of the MOOC, Globalising Higher Education and Research for the Knowledge Economy, they are again deploying a mass technology to blur, in a positive way, the boundaries between critical scholarship and public knowledge. In my own school, academics are involved in a project to revitalise New Zealand's rivers. Called Te Awaroa, it is built on community ties and funded by the Next Foundation, a philanthropic funder of projects that aims to create, in its terms, a legacy of environmental and educational excellence for future generations of New Zealanders. The project is socio-environmental and the knowledge production, the political project is socio-environmental, and the knowledge production process pushes boundaries of accepted interdisciplinary science. It is explicitly political, aiming to clean up environments, redesign regulation, and empower communities through distributive democracy. No, I've got those things in the wrong order. Never mind. Conclusion, then. If there is a direct target for this talk, it is the argument that would identify Barber's avalanche, plot its likely track through institutional autonomy, assume all is lost, and proclaim the death of the university by neoliberalism. It would squeeze out of the story university-based critical projects such as those that I have listed. Fortunately, this may be a straw target. 3 years on from the death of the Public University Symposium, we have enjoyed a debate over institutional autonomy as an historically and geographically contingent field of struggle rather than a right. And the papers in this conference are asking more fine-grained questions of the constituent elements of the category of the university. This is an encouraging context in which to make an argument for a more than oppositional politics that works with whatever institutional autonomy is available to exercise academic freedom, engage with publics, and secure the university as a platform for academics to frame their own critical questions, to demonstrate the value of their work and renew or improve the social contract between university and its publics, yet whilst keeping the more pointed criticality very truly alive. Perhaps it offers an answer to the narrower question of what the public gets for its money that it's always posed to us. And perhaps it offers a means to take back the university, using Gibson Graham's terms. I will finish by pointing to a few tentative strategies that we might be able to draw from these examples. Practicing critique in and from the university requires continued forensic analysis of university practices and continued critique of its repurposing. This pillar of practice should be matched by continued attention to teaching and to shaping environments and opportunities for valuing, infusing and learning with students and colleagues. I'm not sure about Hugh Campbell's reference to social capital, but the morning teas with the Otago Daily Times quiz are identity-forming and deeply affirming. At the risk of replacing one form of critical conceit, that of offering a sharper analysis of reality, with another, that of imagining academics as actually making a difference, the examples I cite invite engagement with publics, what I term an inactive critical scholarship. This requires a different critical disposition and perhaps even an unfamiliar form of academic entrepreneurialism in regard to mobilising resources to make the possible. Here, each of the examples, I believe, is enlightening. There is something about New Zealand here also. Indeed, there is always a situatedness to the political potential and practice of critical thought. In New Zealand, this lies in the very institutional thinness and smallness that, on the one hand, produces our limited intellectual culture and the capacity for governments to change stuff we heard a bit about yesterday, but on the other hand gives us the sort of access underpinning my workshop work. By thinking about criticality more politically, we might work this as a field of potentiality. We should act, as Matheson Russell suggested 3 years ago, as if the university and state were committed to the Education Act and to its own visions, missions and plans. This might include emboldening our VCs by celebrating our mutual interests in the quality of critique, which is the university's competitive advantage in rankings, and is the rent that Barbara and colleagues would seek to unbundle and flog. This seems ground for an emboldening alliance. After all, there is still agency, and VCs are critical of the loss of institutional autonomy and genuinely committed, I believe, to research excellence. They get to make decisions and can and do so differently in different universities. They can choose to accept or reject the recommendations of management consultants to centralise administrative services, just as deans can choose to support or caution publicly against such decisions. It's not impossible that they may frame these commitments in terms different to external research revenue. There are many in this room who perform this politics within the union and beyond. All this might be understood using Gibson Graham's terminology as part of a long-term project to take back the university. For her, taking back involves standing largely outside of the corporate world and creating something different. Perhaps in the university case, Imagineering, like Wright, Greenwood and Bowden, a trust university modelled on Mondragon. In my work, it means inhabiting the new spaces and exploiting the critical potentiality of the university differently, as Tracy McIntosh suggested yesterday. For some, this might involve a more direct engagement with others in different communities, as well as state and capitalist actors. It might mean a creative politics that can be practiced alongside or even in strategic alignment with critical theorising. The examples suggest that we are doing this, but don't talk enough about it, or indeed theorise it. For others, politics is more overtly resistant, or may remain a library or a laboratory-based exercise, running from painstaking forensic deconstruction all the way to scientific measurement. The core of a university might be seen as the capability to continue to ask the questions. I suspect that is the core. Gripped by forces that would direct our expertise to questions posed by others, this may require more and more of the creativity displayed by those cited in the examples. The university is not dead until its academics no longer frame the questions that they ask. Perhaps in the meantime, it's a good thing, I guess, to rattle some of its privileges and some of its exclusive practices. To betray myself finally as Angelina Jolie rather than Quisling, I'll leave you with the Raymond Williams line that to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. Thank you.
That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And it frames the last session of the day today very nicely indeed, because we have people from the ministry and the funding bodies in New Zealand coming to talk to us. And you've set out a particular politics which I know you've been very active in developing with others in New Zealand, and which is an export that New Zealand ought to make more clear to the rest of us in the world. So thank you very much for doing that. Have we got some questions? We've got 5 minutes. Yes, Rebecca.
Thanks, Nick. That was wonderful. I absolutely celebrate your rallying cry to avoid what Jane Kidwell descent into critique, which basically kind of like just leads you to want to slip your wrists if you work on higher education stuff. And it is, it's really, really important, particularly for the fellows of UNIKE, to kind of grasp that the really important thing is to develop new imaginaries and new ways of doing things. And I think it's symptomatic of what universities have become is that a lot of scholars actually feel uncomfortable doing that now. But there's obviously a but in there. It's interesting on this side of we still talk about third mission, because in the UK we're post third mission. We're now impact. And impact's really interesting because third mission started as a kind of, a redefinition of what had been a relational attribute of universities into a functional one. And then with impact, it's tying into research excellence framework and funding, means that suddenly impact's basically third mission, but it's third mission that you measure. You audit, and you attach funds to, and you control your staff through. So what we're getting in the UK now is impact is becoming a management device, whereby there's a lot of universities in the UK are now picking their impact case studies for the next research excellence framework exercise, which will happen in 2018. And they're now managing their staff in their third mission work so that they produce suitable impact case studies. Think about impact, it's going to be measurable. Preferably how much money you save the business, or how many patents you've developed, and so on. So it's about change. And so my point is, this is an ongoing battle. It's a very, very kind of dynamic situation. And it becomes incredibly complicated once the university system and government start fighting back.
Thank you. Have you got any further questions? Yes, please.
Mr. Cullen, I also found your talk quite inspiring, and I totally agree with taking back the university bit. If I did, I just wondering if you could talk about a little bit about core and periphery, getting these networks that are kind of a grassroots into a more central and visible position, both with administrators and with the public.
Yes, Miguel?
Can you just ask if you expanded on the line that you brought up in your very rich presentation on creative development at the end of the panel? Sorry, I didn't like that. Could you just bring up or draw a few more considerations on the concept of creative rebundling that you brought up at the end of the panel as part of your presentation?
Okay, this is a question about creative rebundling. And Miguel is asking Nick to expand on that concept. Okay, Nick, you've got 3 minutes to...
Yeah. I think this, in many ways, they're similar questions. The impact one is interesting because our variant, our PBRF, our variant of the performance assessment exercise, has known about impact since it was first developed in the UK. And as far as we know, it's not been rolled out over us for the next PBRF round. And they have had the opportunity to do that and to specify what impact might be. Some of this might actually filter into directions to the panels a bit later. And I wonder about that. I wonder whether our rather purist new public managers are waking up to the costs of some of these things and whether it's actually worth it. But I also think that two comments you made, it is an ongoing field of struggle, and that's the point. I think that's the very point of the whole talk in many ways. These things, we don't fix these things, so we just continue to struggle. And it's a particular field of struggle. So in our context, the panels are empowered to make decisions. They are not simple, what's the right word? I can't think of it. Ciphers of the technology. They can make decisions. So that some of what I did today, I would be able to articulate into a set of claims about impact, and perhaps find the odd kind of thing to put that in the odd kind of piece of evidence to demonstrate that there had been some kind of impact. So I think even in an impact world, it does introduce another game of being able to demonstrate this kind of stuff. So I haven't had to live through it, so I don't have to live with the dark side of it. Very good question. How do we get the networks to expand and occupy wider spaces? One of the ways that they have found some purchase to get beyond themselves is being able to simply to name themselves in research grant applications, in performance assessments, annual performance reviews, and so on, as being part of this network. Of being able to mobilise the arrival of international scholars, to invite scholars to give presentations, to interest people internationally. How do you generate money for these networks? I'm not quite so sure. Again, within the structures in which we live, you're able to demonstrate that you've got multiple people involved, multiple disciplines, multiple universities, so you are able to leverage off of that. One would hope that HODs, deans, and we have been to the dean to get some funding for one of these networks, begins to look, they begin to look stable and something to actually invest in. So it's, again, an ongoing struggle, and I don't have a simple answer. Creative rebundling. At one level, a cheap metaphorical trick. Sounds good, you've always got to have a title. But at another, I think that many of those, the examples that I cited, are actually bundling up particular dimensions of what a university is in new ways into a network, the kind of particularly collegiality. And this is an answer to the question over there as well. They're bundling up and performing collegiality differently, giving academics an opportunity to discuss, to get outside of their administrative frames, which are often now no longer disciplinary in this part of the world. So they're rebundling discipline, they're rebundling various forms of academic commitment, they're rebundling the student-academic relationship, because many of these networks are held together by student participation as well, grad student participation. So there is a rebundling, so I think it does stand scrutiny from that perspective. But I also like the notion because of the way it plays around with an avalanche is coming.
Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you, Nick, for a wonderful paper and opening up a completely different way of thinking about the politics of hope within universities. So thank you very much, and we move straight into the next session. So thank you, Nick.